Hi everybody, this is Steve. We're back at the whiteboard to talk about choking under pressure, and this is dealing with test anxiety in our situation. The information comes from the book Choke by C. and Bylock, and she's a cognitive psychologist who did a bunch of research in a whole bunch of different areas about people choking under pressure. She does spend some time in the book talking about test anxiety and how that affects students. And we see it as students that we know that are capable of performing at a certain level on a test. And when we go to grade their test, we find out that they didn't get anywhere close to that, right? They just fell flat. So what happens to those students? We know they're capable, but they're not doing it. We may see them do well in assignments or group work, or we may see them discuss things and explain concepts in classes, but when we get their test back, they show no signs of any of that. What's happening? What's really happening is in the working memory. So this is the diagram of the learning cycle. I addressed where all of this comes from in the article UDL Cure in Makerspace Oh My, and how they all align. So if you want to get the background of this, if you haven't watched it, please go back, watch that first, and then come back to this, because I'm not really going to explain the whole thing because I've already did that, so I don't want to waste your time. But in this particular instance with test anxiety, it affects this same cycle, because when you're taking a test, you're looking at input coming into your brain in the sensory area. You're integrating it with the information that you already know. There's generally some sort of problem to solve, so that you're trying to apply that information both from the test and from your memory into the new situation where you're solving the problem. And then there's a motor skill to output that information, whether it's filling in a Scantron bubble, or writing an essay question, filling in a blank, choosing the multiple choice, or however you're doing it. Somewhere they have to manipulate a pencil or writing or typing or whatever, or however your test is created. Test anxiety is dealing with the working memory, and it's affecting that because working memory is limited. So we're up into the frontal lobe. So the front integrative cortex, where we are looking at higher order cognitive functions like making decisions, applying things to new situations. In that same frontal lobe, we also have the prefrontal cortex, where the working memory happens, where we're getting that information from the test question, and we're holding it in our brains, and we're comparing it to things that we already know, applying it to the new situation, whatever the question is. But that working memory is limited. There's only so much information that we can hold for a short period of time without getting overloaded. So test anxiety is really about cognitive overload, because we can't do two things at once. When we get test anxiety, when a student chokes on a test, they start worrying about other things. What happens if I fail this test? What happens if I fail this class? I'm not good enough in this. I'm not a math person. I'm not a science person, or they're dealing with negative stereotypes from a racial or an ethnic group. Somehow they're convincing themselves that there's something that they have to worry about. They're anxious about something. What if I make a mistake? If you think about making a mistake, you probably will, because your working memory is now being consumed with the anxious thought as opposed to being consumed with the test question. We can't do two things at once in our brain. We're doing one or the other. It's the myth of multitasking, right? You can't do two things. You can't multitask. You're actually task switching. You're going back and forth. So instead of having that prefrontal cortex focusing, our working memory focusing on the information from the test question, we're focusing on thoughts like, what if I make a mistake? What if I don't get this right? And then your brain is starting to compete with itself. It's like, well, I've got to answer this question, but what if I get it wrong? I've got to answer this question. What if I get it wrong? So there's a couple things that can happen. It can block things. You can be so consumed in the working memory that it blocks the way your brain works as a network, and you can't go back to retrieve memories that you already have, that you've studied, like memorizing terminology, or memorizing a process, or memorizing steps to solving a math equation. your brain will block that. That's how you get students that blank out. They just have that blank stare. It's like, I don't even know what to do, even though the last couple of weeks they've been answering things on the whiteboard without any problems at all, because their working memory is consumed with a different thought, not the test. Or it slows them down, right? Because they're switching from one task to the other. They're switching from anxious thought to test question to anxious thought to test question. So this whole network slows down. And what that does is doesn't give them enough time to answer all the questions. So if you've ever seen a test where they've answered the first 3/4 of the questions and nothing at the back, it's like, that's because they're consumed with different thoughts. It's not necessarily the test, it's that they're thinking about other things. And it's slowing them down. Instead of concentrating on the test question, they're concentrating on anxious thoughts. It makes students prone to errors because they're not focused. Working memory, the prefrontal cortex, is one of the places where you have attention, right? It blocks out distractions. If you're consumed with other thoughts, your brain's ability to block out distractions is gone. So like every little thing is driving you crazy. Every little noise in the room is driving you crazy. But when you're not under pressure, that doesn't bother you at all. You just keep going and solve the problem and move ahead. So it's all about the working memory in the prefrontal cortex interrupting how your brain normally functions in a less pressured situation. So now that we know that test anxiety is about a cognitive overload of the working memory, we can do things, we can enact strategies to help reduce that cognitive load and help students focus back on the test. We can offload these anxious thoughts, like through expressive writing, where they can write about their worries. They can express it, name it, let it go. We can build their confidence if it's imposter thoughts, right? We can have them expressive write about things that they're interested in, things that they're good at, things that they've achieved, so that they can realize that they are supposed to be here. They can be here. They do have the capability to boost their confidence and reduce those anxious thoughts. We can do things to help them with capacity. Remember? Working memory is limited. There's only so much information you can handle. And if you're dealing with anxious thoughts and information from the test questions, you may not have enough room to deal with the process that you have to go through to solve a problem. So one of the techniques, for example, is writing down those processes and those steps the first thing when you start a test, even before you look at a question. So that basically becomes an external working memory. So when you're in the test question, you're looking at the information and you don't have to hold the process in your brain because you've got it over here. And that way you won't miss steps because your anxiety level is high. Or you can avoid those anxious thoughts in the first place. There's a lot of stress management techniques, meditation techniques that will help them reduce those anxious thoughts in the first place so that they have more working memory to deal with the test question. So it's not that they're not capable, it's that they're getting blocked, or their cognitive network is being slowed down because there's an anxious thought that's competing with the working memory space that should be devoted to the test question. I'd love to talk to you about it. It's really interesting stuff. It's going to apply to different students. It's going to apply to different courses in different ways. So give me an email or a ring. We can sit down and discuss how it applies to you. In the article below, there's tips and strategies more than what I just talked about, because there's a whole bunch of different ways to attack this. So you can read through those. Of course, you can always go to the book if you want to. If you don't want to buy it, it's available at the San Antonio Public Library, where you can pick it up on hold right here across the street at Saltonfuss, at the Las Palmas hold area. And at the very bottom of the article is an optional video with Cian Beilock talking about choking under pressure, and it's her talking about one of her studies on math questions and dealing with the pressure of working through math when you don't think that you're good at math. So she actually gets some of the brain images from her fMRI study and like points things out and these are the different areas that are being activated at this particular time. So it kind of gets into the nitty gritty, so it's kind of fun. So if you want to nerd out on choking under pressure, it's a really good video. But there's a lot of stuff to go through. It's working memory cognitive overload. And to help students deal with test anxiety, it's giving them strategies to deal with that cognitive overload so they can reduce it and allow their brain to go through the process the way it's meant to go through the process. I'll talk to you next time.